Lately, I've spent a lot of time mapping out Iranian military sites, and the one thing you constantly find are these underground missile bases. Just everywhere you look, on the outskirts of pretty much every major city you find one, or even multiple. So I decided to do a deep dive into their ballistic missile arsenal. These are the weapons that Iran is most famous for, and constantly show off to demonstrate their power, even using them on multiple occasions. So, I've done a deep dive again to figure out the exact numbers of these missiles that Iran has, plus what kind of damage they could achieve. But first, to understand their ballistic missiles, you need to understand a bit about Iran's military. Iran is weird. They actually have two complete and separate armies, each complete with their own ground, air, and naval forces. If that sounds horribly inefficient, duplicating efforts and adding costs, that's because it is. But they have their reasons. Those armies are the Artesh and the Sepah, or IRGC. The Artesh is more the traditional standing army, established to protect Iran's territory and government. The IRGC is more ideological. It was set up in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and tasked to protect and continue carrying out the goals of their revolution, both at home and abroad. Because of this, they're more independent from government control and answer directly to the supreme leader, and this has given them a lot of power and influence. They are the much more active, go-get-stuff-done force. They're the ones in control of all those ballistic missiles, the huge swarms of attack boats that seek to control the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz from things like US aircraft carrier strike groups, as well as carrying out counterinsurgency operations inside Iran while at the same time supporting, funding, and arming insurgency groups across the region. Groups from things like Hezbollah to the Houthi, and to a lesser extent Hamas and even the Taliban. Basically, Iran's whole concept of defense is now based around the IRGC. They know there's no possible way they could ever defend themselves against a country like the US with conventional forces. So why bother trying? Plus, the Artesh, the regular army, has always been looked at with some level of suspicion due to Iran's history of military coups. The whole Iranian Revolution was overthrowing the Shah of Iran, who was put into power in a coup 25 years earlier, in which the Artesh played an active role. So Iran uses the IRGC as a means to protect and promote their interest and influence asymmetrically. Again, with things like swarm attacks with small civilian boats, those proxy groups like Hezbollah and the Houthi, and massive numbers of ballistic missiles. But what kind of damage could those missiles achieve? They look massive and powerful when they strike, but what about true destruction? The easiest and best example to look at is damage to air bases. They have a good selection of different types of targets, from buildings to bunkers to open concrete hardstands with real vulnerable things like aircraft. They are also the primary target for Iran, being how much the US and Israel rely on air power. And in the last few years, Iran has attacked several with ballistic missiles, and it gives us good examples to go off of. The thing you gotta understand is airbases are really difficult targets to destroy. They're huge, and they're mostly just flat open concrete areas that can be quickly and easily patched. Other things like aiming to destroy aircraft there, or fuel or ammo depots, well, new ones could be just brought in and keep the base running, at least temporarily. Also, despite ballistic missiles being extremely fast, their flight trajectory makes them easier to detect early on and at least gives some time to prepare. Countries like the US and Israel have the capabilities to detect early launches of ballistic missiles, and would give them 10 to 15 minutes to react. That's not much time, but enough to limit damage by taking shelter, possibly moving aircraft. Even just over a short distance can be enough to limit the blast damage of conventional ballistic missiles. So what kind of damage could they actually do? Most conventionally armed ballistic missiles have a 500 to 1,000 kilogram warhead, including Iran's. Using high explosive warheads, those would roughly create overpressure levels of 5 psi in a radius of about 80 and 110 meters. 5 psi is a good number to go by because it's enough to completely destroy any normal building, while causing less, but still some serious damage to any concrete or reinforced buildings like typically found at military bases. But there are things you could do to limit this. You'll find at most air bases, or really any military bases, there are many dirt walls and revetments and other barriers to further limit the blast damage to a smaller area to protect other buildings, vehicles, aircraft, or any other valuable equipment nearby. And sure enough, we could see satellite imagery from Iran's previous strikes with limited damage, much less than that 80 to 110 meter radius. Of course, there is other damage that can't be seen on satellite imagery, like from smaller debris flying, but that would be limited and even random. So in terms of this attack, at Al-Asad Air Base in Iraq, it served as a great propaganda victory and a huge embarrassment for the US, but not much else. It had no real or noticeable effect on the operations of the base. In fact, in this satellite imagery of the same section of the base just a couple weeks later, you'd be hard-pressed to even identify any damage. The Predator and Reaper drones seen here before the strike were still there after, a year later, and even in the latest Google image almost 5 years after the fact. Also, this is just a small part of the overall base. So what will be required to really make a difference? There's some conflicting information about the strike on Asad. Iran said it launched 3 waves, each spread out about 15 minutes. The US said 2 waves, about an hour apart. The US also said there was a total of 11 missiles at Asad. Iraq said 17, and Iran simply said tens of missiles, and then later said 13 at Asad. Now obviously, to do any real damage, to shut down or disable this base over a longer period, a lot more would be required. That's not to say Iranian missiles are bad. In fact, they seem to be incredibly accurate, but it's just the nature of the limited amount of damage that ballistic missiles armed with conventional warheads can do. You'd need 10 times more, if not even more than that, to do the required levels of damage. And that's without any air defense shooting them down. Since the attack, the US deployed a Patriot air defense system, which would only increase the number of ballistic missiles needed. And this is only one airbase. In a war, there would be a few dozen Israeli and US bases in the region that would pose a risk to Iran. So we are easily talking about many thousands of missiles they'd need. And in addition to that, that's only air bases. So that brings up the important question: just how many missiles does Iran have? Well, that's a real tricky one to figure out. Iran doesn't release those figures, and the US rarely states exact numbers. That's unsurprising, as they don't want Iran and the world to know just what they know and what they don't know, or possibly reveal their sources. But in 2022, General McKenzie stated to Congress that Iran had over 3,000 ballistic missiles of various types. That means everything from short range to long range. But beside that, we're on our own. There's a few things we could do to get an estimate. One way is to look at the released budgets. In 2021, Iran's new president submitted a budget for about $250 million to ballistic missile projects. Assuming that's true, and that the amount has stayed roughly the same for the last 2 decades, and that only a portion of that is for actual procurement, while the rest would be for things like missile bases, infrastructure, support equipment, testing, so on, and estimating the approximate cost per missile, you could get an idea, but that is a lot of assumptions. Or you can look at actual production. Iran has several known production facilities, based on size, and using known numbers from things like Soviet production rates, and then extrapolating from there for years of production can give you some clues. But again, it's a lot of assumptions, and there's the possibility of unknown production sites or the efficiency of them. You could also do other things like trying to figure out how many they think they would need, and also looking at satellite imagery and counting bases and estimating numbers. And I did all this math, and it puts us right around 4,200 ballistic missiles total. Again, it's only an estimate with a lot of assumptions obviously, but it's not that far off from the 3,000 plus the US stated 3 years ago. The vast majority of those are shorter range missiles though. The magic number Iran has struggled to achieve is about 1,000 miles, or about 1,600 kilometer range missiles. This is what they needed to be able to strike Israel. These are obviously much larger and require more support infrastructure, making them more expensive and therefore less of them. To get an idea of how many of those, we can look at satellite imagery a little closer. Iran is extremely mountainous, which gives them many opportunities to hide and conceal missile bases inside these mountains, especially in the western and southern parts of the country closer to Israel and US bases in the Arabian Peninsula. And sure enough, everywhere you look you seem to come across a missile base built into the side of hills and mountains. Iran has claimed that they have missile bases in all provinces and all cities. All cities is likely too much of a stretch, but each of Iran's 31 provinces is absolutely believable. I've counted close to 50 of various sizes, and you can often tell which ones are for longer range missiles based on the infrastructure, like this one here. The number of missiles and the layout of these sites, though, is hard to know. Iran released a video in early January 2025 showing the inside of one of these underground missile bases, which is pretty rare. The exact location of the base isn't stated, but it shows off missiles like the Ahmad and Ghadir, which have ranges long enough to reach Israel from most locations in Iran. They don't reveal or state much in the video to give clues to its location, except a vague metaphor for a dormant volcano. It's obviously a metaphor implying the missile base is like a dormant volcano, not currently erupting, but could unleash fury and erupt or fire its missiles in the future. But it could also be a vague reference to its location. Iran has several dormant volcanoes, but only a few match the Iranian missile bases within range of Israel. One more likely of which is Shahand. There we know a missile base exists carrying similar range missiles. It's so close to Shahand that it would probably have a pretty cool view of the mountain. Its layout though isn't a great match. My other favorite potential site is Shiraz. Here is a base also equipped with those longer range missiles, and some pretty incredible footage came out from a civilian airliner that captured Iran's launching ballistic missiles in their strike on Israel back in October. And its geography seems to match better. But regardless of whether this is the exact site or not, the video gives us a general idea of the layout of these underground bases. Saying these bases are underground might be a bit deceptive. They are underground, but more accurately, they're built into the side of mountains. Either way, it obviously helps with survivability and it hides them from view, but it creates a weak point, those tunnels to the surface. Each missile base has multiple of them, and they can be hard to make out at times. But striking those entrances can leave the weapons and equipment stuck underground and unusable. So to sum it up, how much damage can these really do? Huge volleys of drones and ballistic missiles can inflict some costly damage, but as we've seen in Ukraine, they're not going to win you the war. Russia has launched several thousand missiles into Ukraine at everything from ammo depots to air bases to power plants. But 3 years later, and Ukraine is still fighting and relatively holding the line. So, in conclusion, Iran's ballistic missile arsenal has grown massively, and individually they're pretty capable. They've shown to be very accurate and decently reliable, but there's just too many targets, and their warhead size of just 1 ton is relatively small considering the huge size of things like air bases. At best, Iran could cause some serious disruption and closures of these bases, and maybe completely disable a few, but that's it. It's really just a one-punch weapon. After that, they're left with little else. The real game changer obviously would come if Iran ever decided to build nuclear weapons.